Welcome, dear viewers, to a tale of unexpected love and second chances. Enjoy the story. Linda Matthews stepped out of her sleek office building, her Louboutin heels clicking against the pavement as she approached her BMW. The weight of another monotonous day settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. At 43, Linda was the epitome of corporate success, CEO of a thriving marketing firm, with a corner office boasting a view of the Manhattan skyline. Yet, as she stood there, key fob in hand, she felt utterly empty. Same old, she muttered, suddenly pocketing her keys and turning away from her car. Not today. On a whim, Linda decided to walk home. It wasn't far, just a few blocks, but it was a deviation from her usual routine, a small act of rebellion against the clockwork precision of her life. As she strolled down the bustling New York street, a brightly colored ice cream cart caught her eye. Linda raised an eyebrow, surprised to see such an old-fashioned vendor in this part of town. Why not, she thought, approaching the cart. I'll have a vanilla cone, please. The vendor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, smiled as she scooped the ice cream. That'll be $2, dear. Linda blinked in surprise. $2? Are you sure? The woman chuckled. Yes, honey. Not everything in this city needs to cost an arm and a leg. As Linda fumbled in her designer purse for cash, something she rarely carried, she felt a strange mix of embarrassment and nostalgia. When was the last time she'd bought something so simple, so normal? Cone in hand, Linda made her way to the nearby park. She settled onto a bench, feeling oddly out of place in her tailored suit among the joggers and dog walkers. As she took her first lick of the ice cream, memories of her childhood flooded back. Eat it slowly, Linda, she mimicked her grandmother's voice, or your tongue will freeze and fall off. Linda smiled sadly at the recollection. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just 5. She'd been gone for years now, but the memories were still vivid. Lost in thought, Linda didn't notice the ice cream beginning to melt until a deep voice startled her. Excuse me, miss, but you're about to have a vanilla waterfall on your skirt. Linda jerked back to reality, narrowly avoiding a creamy disaster on her expensive outfit. She looked up to see a man standing before her, his blue eyes twinkling with amusement. Oh, thank you, she stammered, hastily licking the drips from the cone. The man gestured to the empty spot beside her. Mind if I join you? I promise I'm not usually in the habit of rescuing strangers from ice cream catastrophes. Linda found herself nodding, intrigued by this handsome stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere. He settled beside her, his casual jeans and t-shirt a stark contrast to her polished appearance. I'm Paul, he said, extending his hand. Paul Rogers. Linda Matthews, she replied, shaking his hand and feeling an unexpected spark at his touch. So, Linda Matthews, Paul grinned, what brings a woman in a power suit to a park bench with a $2 ice cream cone? Linda laughed, surprised at how easy it felt. Would you believe a midlife crisis? As they talked, Linda found herself opening up to Paul in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. There was something about his easygoing nature and genuine interest that made her feel seen. Before she knew it, the sun was setting and her ice cream was long gone. Oh my, Linda exclaimed, glancing at her watch. I can't believe how late it's gotten. Paul stood, offering his hand to help her up. Time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? Listen, Linda, I know this might seem forward, but would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Linda hesitated. It had been years since she'd been on a date, and the thought both thrilled and terrified her. But as she looked into Paul's warm eyes, she found herself nodding. Yes, she said, surprised at her own boldness. I'd like that very much. As they exchanged numbers and said their goodbyes, Linda felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 months flew by in a whirlwind of romantic dinners, long walks in the park, and conversations that lasted until the wee hours of the morning. Linda felt like a teenager again, giddy with the excitement of new love. One evening, as they strolled hand in hand through Central Park, Paul suddenly stopped, turning to face Linda with an intensity that made her breath catch. Linda, he began, his voice trembling slightly. These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. I know it might seem fast, but I love you. Will you marry me? Linda's heart soared even as her practical mind raced. It was fast, incredibly fast. But at 43, hadn't she waited long enough for happiness? Yes, she breathed, throwing her arms around Paul's neck. Yes, I'll marry you. As Paul slipped a modest but beautiful ring onto her finger, Linda felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. But along with the happiness came a flicker of fear. There was still so much they didn't know about each other. Later that night, as they sat on Linda's plush sofa, champagne glasses in hand, Linda decided it was time for some honest conversation. Paul, she began hesitantly, there's something I need to tell you. I can't have children. I found out last year when I looked into fertility treatments. The doctor said it's not possible for me. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction. To her surprise, Paul simply squeezed her hand and smiled softly. Linda, I love you for who you are, not for the children you might give me. We can always adopt if we decide we want kids later on. Relief washed over Linda, but she wasn't finished. There's more. I'm not great with people, especially children. They make me uncomfortable. I've built my life around my work, and I'm not sure how good I'll be at being a wife. I'm set in my ways, Paul. I like my space, my routines. Are you sure you want to sign up for that? Paul listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. I appreciate your honesty, Linda. I know it's not easy to be vulnerable like this. I want you to know that I love all of you. Your strengths, your quirks, everything. We'll figure out the rest together, okay? Linda nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. As Paul pulled her into a tender embrace, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, happily ever after, was possible after all. 3 weeks before the wedding, Linda was in full planning mode. She'd thrown herself into the preparations with the same intensity she applied to her business dealings. Everything had to be perfect. She was pacing her living room, phone in hand, when she realized Paul was late for their appointment with the tailor. Where is he? She muttered, checking her watch for the 10th time. He knows how important this is. Just as she was about to call him again, her phone rang. Her heart leapt when she saw Paul's name on the screen. Paul, where are you? We're going to be late. Ma'am? An unfamiliar voice interrupted. Is this Linda Matthews? Linda's blood ran cold. Yes, this is she. Who is this? Where's Paul? Ma'am, I'm Officer Johnson with the NYPD. I'm afraid Mr. Rogers has been in a car accident. He's been taken to Mount Sinai Hospital. His condition is serious but stable. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Linda struggled to process the information. I'll be right there, she managed to say before hanging up. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Linda's mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. By the time she reached the emergency room, she was nearly hysterical. Please, she begged the nurse at the desk. I need to see Paul Rogers. I'm his fiancé. After what felt like an eternity of waiting and answering questions, a doctor finally approached her. Miss Matthews? Mr. Rogers is out of surgery. He has a concussion and some broken ribs, but he's going to be okay. He's still under anesthesia, but you can see him briefly if you'd like. Linda nodded gratefully, following the doctor to Paul's room. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, pale and bruised, hooked up to various machines. She took his hand gently, mindful of the IV. Oh, Paul, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm here, darling. You're going to be all right. Suddenly, Paul's fingers twitched in hers. His eyelids fluttered, and he mumbled something incoherent. Linda leaned closer. What is it, Paul? I'm here. Emma, Paul murmured, his voice thick with medication. Don't worry, baby. Daddy's coming home soon. Linda froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Emma? Daddy? What was Paul talking about? Before she could process this bombshell, a nurse gently ushered her out of the room, explaining that Paul needed rest. In a daze, Linda made her way to the hospital cafeteria. She collapsed into a chair, her mind reeling. Who was Emma? Did Paul have a child he'd never told her about? And if so, what else had he been hiding? As the shock wore off, anger began to set in. How could Paul have kept something so important from her, Didn't she deserve to know if she was marrying a man with a child? Determined to get answers, Linda pulled out her phone and dialed the number of Paul's best friend, Mark. "Linda, is everything okay?" Mark's voice was cautious. "No, Mark, everything is not okay," Linda snapped. "Paul's been in an accident and he just called out for someone named Emma. He called himself Daddy. What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Mark sighed heavily. "I think you'd better come over, Linda. There's something you need to know." Linda's hand shook as she knocked on Mark's door. Part of her wanted to run away, to pretend she'd never heard Paul's delirious words, but she knew she couldn't. She had to face whatever truth was waiting for her. Mark opened the door, his face grave. "Come in, Linda. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way." As Linda settled onto Mark's couch, he handed her a framed photograph. Linda's breath caught in her throat. It was Paul, smiling broadly, with a little girl perched on his shoulders. The child couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, with Paul's blue eyes and a mop of curly brown hair. "That's Emma," Mark said softly. "Paul's daughter." Linda stared at the photo, her mind struggling to reconcile this new information with the man she thought she knew. How old is she?" "She'll be 7 next month," Mark replied. "Paul's ex-wife left when Emma was just a baby. He's raised her on his own ever since." Linda's head snapped up. "His ex-wife? He was married before?" Mark nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah, about 8 years ago. It didn't last long. She wasn't ready to be a mother, I guess. Just up and left one day." Linda felt like she was drowning in a sea of revelations. Where's Emma now? Why didn't Paul tell me about her? "She lives with Paul's mother in New Jersey," Mark explained. "As for why he didn't tell you, Linda, you have to understand. Paul was scared. He knew how you felt about kids, how focused you were on your career. He was afraid you'd reject him if you knew he came with a child." Linda stood up abruptly, anger flaring in her chest. "So he thought lying to me was a better option? We were going to get married, for God's sake. Did he think he could just keep his daughter a secret forever?" Mark held up his hands placatingly. "I know it's a shock, Linda, but Paul loves you. He was planning to tell you everything after the wedding. He wanted you to love him for who he is first, before complicating things with Emma." Linda laughed bitterly. "Complicating things? Is that what he thinks his daughter is? A complication?" She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "I need to see her. I need to see Emma." "Linda, wait!" Mark called after her. "Paul's mother's address is in his phone. The passcode is Emma's birthday, 0517. Linda nodded curtly and left, her mind made up. She had to see this child, had to understand the life Paul had been hiding from her all this time. As she drove towards New Jersey, Linda's emotions swirled like a tempest. Anger at Paul's deception warred with fear of what this meant for their future. And underneath it all, a tiny voice whispered a truth she wasn't ready to face. That maybe, just maybe, she was more upset about being lied to than about the existence of Emma herself. Linda's GPS guided her to a small, well-kept house on a quiet suburban street. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage. Finally, taking a deep breath, she approached the front door and knocked. The door opened to reveal an older woman with Paul's kind blue eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "Mrs. Rogers?" Linda's voice trembled slightly. "I'm Linda Matthews. I was engaged to your son, Paul." Recognition dawned in the older woman's eyes. "Oh, Linda, Paul's told me so much about you. Please come in and call me Margaret." As Linda stepped into the cozy living room, her eyes were immediately drawn to a small figure curled up on the couch, engrossed in a book. Margaret followed her gaze. "Emma, sweetheart, we have a visitor. This is Linda, your daddy's friend." The little girl looked up, and Linda felt her heart skip a beat. Emma was the spitting image of Paul, from her sparkling blue eyes to the dimple in her left cheek when she smiled. "Hi, Linda," Emma said shyly. "Are you the lady from Daddy's phone? He said you were pretty and he was right." Linda felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's nice to meet you, Emma. Your daddy's told me a lot about you, too." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to shatter this child's world. Margaret ushered Linda to a seat and disappeared into the kitchen to make tea. Left alone with Emma, Linda felt a wave of panic. She'd never been good with children. What was she supposed to say? But Emma solved the problem for her. "Do you want to see my drawings?" she asked, already reaching for a sketchbook. For the next hour, Linda found herself drawn into Emma's world. The little girl chattered away, showing Linda her artwork, her favorite toys, and even performing an impromptu dance routine. To her surprise, Linda found herself laughing and asking questions, genuinely interested in this precocious child. Emma's joy was infectious, and Linda felt the ice around her heart beginning to melt. As Emma ran upstairs to fetch her super special art project, Margaret returned with a fresh pot of tea. "She's a wonderful child," Linda said softly, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with love. "She is. Paul's done an amazing job with her, considering, well, everything." Linda's curiosity got the better of her. "What happened with Emma's mother, if you don't mind me asking?" Margaret's expression darkened. Cheryl was never cut out to be a mother. She and Paul were young. It was a whirlwind romance. When she got pregnant, Paul was over the moon. But Cheryl, she resented the baby from the start. When Emma was 3 months old, Cheryl just up and left. No note, no explanation, just gone. Linda felt a surge of anger towards this woman she'd never met. How could anyone abandon their child like that? Margaret shrugged sadly. "I'll never understand it myself. But Paul, he stepped up in ways I never imagined. He became both mother and father to Emma. It hasn't been easy, but he's given that little girl more love than most kids get from 2 parents." As if on cue, Emma came bounding down the stairs, a large piece of construction paper in her hands. "Look, Linda, I made this for Daddy's new house. Do you think he'll like it?" Linda examined the colorful drawing of a house with 3 stick figures in front. A tall man, a little girl, and a woman with long hair. Her throat tightened as she realized the woman was meant to be her. "It's beautiful, Emma," she managed to say. "I'm sure your daddy will love it." As Linda prepared to leave, Emma threw her arms around her in an impulsive hug. "Will you come back and visit us again? Maybe we can all have ice cream together." Linda found herself nodding, surprised by the warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd like that very much, Emma." On the drive back to the city, Linda's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The anger she'd felt towards Paul was still there, but it was tempered now by understanding. She could see why he'd been afraid to tell her about Emma, even if she didn't agree with his decision to hide the truth. More surprising was the realization that meeting Emma hadn't been the disaster she'd feared. The little girl was charming, intelligent, and so full of love for her father. Linda found herself wondering what it would be like to be a part of their little family. But could she do it? Could she, Linda Matthews, career woman extraordinaire, become a stepmother? The thought was terrifying and yet oddly appealing. The next morning, Linda returned to the hospital, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. As she approached Paul's room, she heard voices inside, one of them achingly familiar. "Daddy, when are you coming home? I miss you." Linda froze outside the door, listening to Paul's gentle response. "Soon, Princess. Daddy just needs to get a little stronger first. Are you being good for Grandma?" "Uh-huh. Oh, and I met your friend Linda yesterday. She's nice, Daddy. Can she come live with us when you get better?" There was a pause, and Linda could almost picture the panic on Paul's face. "Emma, sweetie, it's complicated. Linda and we need to talk about some grown-up things first." Unable to eavesdrop any longer, Linda knocked softly and entered the room. Paul's face paled when he saw her, while Emma's lit up with excitement. "Linda, you came to visit Daddy too?" Linda managed a smile for the little girl. "I did, Emma. Would you mind giving your daddy and me a few minutes to talk? I think your grandma is waiting in the cafeteria with some ice cream." Once Emma had bounced out of the room, an uncomfortable silence fell between Paul and Linda. Finally, Paul spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know," it wasn't a question, but Linda nodded anyway. "Yes, I know. Paul, how could you keep this from me? We were going to get married, for heaven's sake." Paul's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Linda. I wanted to tell you, I really did. But every time I tried, I was so afraid of losing you. I know how you feel about kids, about family commitments. I thought if you got to know me first, if you fell in love with me, maybe I'd be more willing to accept a ready-made family." Linda finished for him, her tone sharp. "Did you really think so little of me, Paul? Did you think I was so shallow that I'd reject you just because you have a child?" Paul reached for her hand, but Linda pulled away. "No, Linda, it wasn't like that. I've been hurt before. When Emma's mother left, it nearly destroyed me. The thought of opening my heart again, of risking rejection not just for me but for Emma too. I was a coward, Linda. I know that now." Linda sank into the chair beside his bed, suddenly exhausted. "I met her, you know. Emma. She's wonderful, Paul. She's smart and funny and so full of life. How could you ever think I wouldn't love her?" Paul's eyes widened in surprise. You love her?" Linda paused, realizing the truth of her own words. "I think I do. It's crazy, isn't it? I've always been terrified of children, of the mess and the noise and the responsibility, but Emma, she's different. Special." A tentative smile spread across Paul's face. "She is special. Linda, I'm so sorry I didn't trust you with the truth. Can you ever forgive me?" Linda took a deep breath, searching her heart for the answer. "I don't know, Paul. You hurt me deeply. You made me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. But, Paul prompted, hope shining in his eyes. "But I love you," Linda admitted. "And I think I might love your daughter too. I'm not saying it will be easy, and we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust. But if you're willing to try, so am I." Paul reached for her hand again, and this time, Linda let him take it. "I love you, Linda. You and Emma, you're my whole world. Whatever it takes, I'll make this right. I promise." Just then, Emma burst back into the room, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream. "Daddy, Linda, guess what? Grandma says we can all have a movie night when you come home. Can we watch Frozen? Please?" As Paul and Linda exchanged amused glances, Linda felt a warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't the life she'd planned for herself, but looking at Paul and Emma's smiling faces, she realized it might just be better than anything she could have imagined. The summer sun shone brightly on the small gathering in Central Park. Linda stood nervously at the makeshift altar, smoothing down her simple white dress for the 100th time. "Stop fidgeting," her maid of honor Sarah whispered. "You look beautiful." Linda took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. Just then, the small string quartet began to play and all heads turned to watch the procession. Paul appeared first, looking dashing in his gray suit. But it was the sight behind him that brought tears to Linda's eyes. Emma, resplendent in a puffy pink dress, walked slowly down the aisle, tossing rose petals with great concentration. As Paul took his place beside Linda, Emma moved to stand between them, beaming up at the couple. The officiant smiled warmly at the trio before addressing the guests. "Friends and family, we are gathered here today not just to witness the union of Paul and Linda, but to celebrate the creation of a new family." As the ceremony progressed, Linda found her nervousness melting away. This felt right, in a way she never could have imagined a year ago. When it came time for the vows, Paul turned to face her, his eyes shining with love. "Linda, you came into my life like a whirlwind, turning everything upside down in the best possible way. You've taught me the true meaning of partnership, of honesty, and of unconditional love. I promise to always be open with you, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, and to be the best husband and father I can be. I love you, now and always." Linda blinked back tears as she began her own vows. "Paul, this past year has been a journey I never expected to take. You and Emma have shown me that there's more to life than boardrooms and bottom lines. You've opened my heart in ways I never thought possible. I promise to be your partner in all things, to love Emma as my own, and to always make time for family ice cream nights." There was a ripple of laughter from the guests at this last part, an inside joke that had become a staple in their household. After exchanging rings, the officiant had one last surprise. "And now, I believe Miss Emma has something she'd like to say." Emma stepped forward, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. Her voice was clear and strong as she read, "Dear Linda, thank you for loving me and my daddy. Thank you for reading me bedtime stories and helping me with my homework and making the best pancakes ever. I'm really happy you're going to be my mom now. I love you." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering as Linda knelt down and embraced Emma, whispering, "I love you too, sweetheart. So very much." As the newlyweds made their way back down the aisle, hand in hand with Emma between them, Linda marveled at the twists and turns her life had taken. From a chance encounter over melting ice cream to this moment of pure joy, she had found a love and a family she never knew she wanted. Life wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges and disagreements, moments of doubt and frustration. But looking at Paul and Emma, Linda knew that together they could face anything. This was her happily ever after, messy and beautiful and real. As they reached the end of the aisle, Paul leaned in close and whispered, "So, Mrs. Rogers, ready for our next adventure?" Linda smiled, squeezing his hand in Emma's. "Absolutely. Bring it on." And with that, they stepped forward into their new life together, a family united by love, trust, and the occasional scoop of ice cream.